If there is one iconic Hollywood star who possessed both a mysterious aura and an absolutely magnetic stage presence, it would be Yul Brynner. Even a brief glimpse at his piercing gaze in classic films like The King and I, The Ten Commandments, or The Magnificent Seven immediately reveals someone who commanded attention wherever he went. Yet behind those penetrating eyes lay a complex personal history full of adventure, struggle, scandal, and triumph. In today's journey, we're going to dive deep into the life of Yul Brynner, unraveling the details from his tumultuous childhood in Russia and China, the early days of performing in nightclubs and circus tents in Paris, his slow but steady rise in America, and the scandals and romances that seemed to follow him wherever he turned. Yul Brynner was born in Vladivostok, Russia, on July 11th, 1920, although there have been occasional discrepancies about his exact birth date. He sometimes claimed 1915, 1917, or other years, adding to the mystique. His original full name was Yuli Borisovich Brynner. Vladivostok, located in the far east of Russia near the Sea of Japan, was a melting pot of cultures in the early 20th century. Chinese, Japanese, Russian, and various other ethnicities all converging. This somewhat cosmopolitan environment might have primed young Yul for a life of travel and multicultural exploration. His father, Boris Brynner, was a Swiss-Russian mining engineer known for having a wandering eye, something that became all too obvious when he abandoned the family for another woman. Meanwhile, Yul's mother, Marusia Dmitrievna, often referred to as Mikhailovna or simply Maria, was an actress and singer with a passion for the arts. She clearly had her own ambitions and talents, which would prove influential for her children. Yul was not an only child. He had an older sister, Vera, who would go on to become an opera singer. It's interesting that both Brynner's siblings pursued musical and dramatic paths, suggesting their mother's artistic leanings truly permeated the family atmosphere. Indeed, from a young age, Yul was surrounded by the sounds of performance, singing, theater, and stage presence. Although at that time, nobody could have predicted how far his own theatrical gifts would carry him. The idyllic family life, if it ever existed, crumbled in 1923 when Boris left for a business trip and never returned. He had met an actress elsewhere and simply decided to start a new life without so much as a backward glance. This sudden desertion shook the household to its core. Yul's mother, rather than collapsing under heartbreak, responded with fierce determination. She gathered her children, Yul, then just a small boy, and Vera, the older sister, and relocated to Harbin, a city in northeastern China. Harbin was sometimes called the Paris of the Orient, thanks to its European architecture and sizable expatriate communities. It was in Harbin that Yul first attended classes at a local YMCA, studying in a multicultural environment. While we don't have precise records of his day-to-day life there, it's not difficult to imagine how the hustle and bustle of that international crossroads would have shaped him. The experience might have planted seeds of cosmopolitan flair and an openness to languages and cultures, something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. However, the political tensions between China and Japan were growing in the early 1930s, and Yul's mother sensed imminent danger. Fearful that her children might be caught in the middle of a possible conflict, she once again took decisive action. In 1932, the family, Maria, Vera, and 12-year-old Yul, left Asia behind and traveled to Europe. This time, the destination was the real Paris, France. Imagine being just 12, landing in a foreign city with a completely new language and culture, and having already lived in 2 different countries. But Yul seemed to adapt well. The cultural shift didn't dampen his drive for artistic pursuits, and he soon picked up the guitar. That skill would open doors to his very first public performances. entertaining patrons in Russian nightclubs around the city. One can imagine these smoky, lively Parisian locales where Russian émigrés gathered, and the teenage Yul on stage strumming his guitar, accompanied by his sister's operatic voice. They performed a mix of Russian folk songs and Roma gypsy music, which was popular among certain expatriate circles, forging a small but dedicated following. Still, young Brynner was restless. He sought thrills and excitement beyond musical performances in clubs. So he joined a circus school in Paris, training to become a trapeze artist. This wasn't just a passing interest. He spent 5 years pursuing the art of aerial acrobatics. By all accounts, he was quite skilled, though he later revealed that the physically demanding discipline left him with chronic back pain. A brutal accident at some point finally forced him to abandon the trapeze, but it's possible that the flair for showmanship he honed on the high wire carried over into his stage and film presence. That same intensity, that same sense of risk and physicality would later become part of his dramatic appeal as an actor. Alongside physical pain, he also began to experiment with opium, fairly common in the avant-garde scene of Paris at the time. Whether it was to self-medicate for his back pain or to escape emotional stress from his turbulent childhood, Yul admitted that he became quite dependent on the drug for a time. Some accounts suggest that he was lucky to pull himself out of that addiction relatively unscathed, though it certainly left a mark on his worldview. Further tragedy struck when Yul's mother was diagnosed with leukemia. In a state of shock, mother and son briefly returned to Harbin, while Vera went on to the United States to chase her dream of a singing career. Miraculously, Maria's health improved over the course of 2 years, so she and Yul made the bold choice in 1940 to move to the U.S. for good. They traveled aboard the President Cleveland, departing from Kobe, Japan, and eventually reached San Francisco before settling in New York. Although he was already fluent in French and Russian, Yul's next linguistic conquest was English. He seemed to pick it up quickly, his linguistic talent likely aided by a facility for mimicry and a natural ear, both of which would serve him well on stage. But World War II loomed large in the early 1940s. Yul's plans for immediate stardom had to be put on hold. The Office of War Information, a U.S. government agency, needed French speakers, so Yul found work as a radio announcer and commentator in French, providing broadcasts that were presumably aimed at listeners in Allied occupied territories or in France itself. This role allowed him to stay in the States, where he could still dabble in acting classes and seek stage roles. During this period, he studied with Michael Chekhov, nephew of the legendary Russian playwright Anton Chekhov, and a brilliant disciple of Konstantin Stanislavski, known as the father of method acting. Michael Chekhov's influence on Yul's approach to performance was immense. The introspection and authenticity of Stanislavski's system molded a new generation of American actors, and Yul was right there in the mix alongside people like Clint Eastwood, Jack Palance, and even Marilyn Monroe, each of whom at some point studied in that lineage. In late 1941, Yul Brynner finally scored his first credited acting role on Broadway, a small part in William Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. Although it didn't immediately catapult him to stardom, it was a valuable introduction to the professional theatrical world in New York. But the young man still needed to pay the bills. For a while, Yul worked as a model for the photographer George Platt Lynes. Lynes was a well-respected figure in commercial photography for magazines like Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, but he also had a private fascination with photographing male nudes. Yul, needing the money and perhaps open to artistic experimentation, agreed to pose nude. These images, meant for Lynes's private collection, were later donated to Dr. Alfred Kinsey, the famous sex researcher. Long after Brynner achieved fame, those photos surfaced publicly, causing a stir. Though given his remarkable physique and the changing cultural attitudes over time, it became more an intriguing footnote than a career-ending scandal. By 1944, Yul found himself entering into another dramatic chapter: marriage. He wed actress Virginia Gilmore, a Broadway and film performer with whom he shared certain artistic passions. The couple had a son in 1946 named Rock, sometimes spelled Rock, or Raquel, though typically known as Rock Brynner. However, the union was turbulent from the start. Gilmore famously remarked that two actors could never manage a home together. Someone had to give up. It wasn't going to be Brynner, whose ambition to conquer show business was unwavering. Perhaps Gilmore's frustration only deepened when, soon after marrying, Yul drifted away from on-stage acting and got involved behind the camera, directing for Studio One, a high-end drama series on CBS. He found a sense of fulfillment in directing, but fate had other plans. In 1949, Brynner was convinced to step in front of the camera again for Port of New York, a noir-style film shot in the form of a quasi-documentary. He portrayed a charismatic drug dealer pursued by federal agents. Although the role was small and the film itself somewhat experimental, it was Yul's official cinematic debut. Yet, at that point in time, he still believed his primary calling might be directing rather than acting. That all changed, however, when Broadway star Mary Martin approached him about a new Rodgers and Hammerstein musical called The King and I. This was a golden opportunity. Intrigued by the role of the King of Siam, Brynner auditioned in 1950 and secured the part. It's difficult to overstate how transformative this role was for him. The musical opened on Broadway in 1951, co-starring Gertrude Lawrence as Anna Leonowens, and it became a sensation. Yul's portrayal of the king was compelling, imperious, charismatic, comedic at times, and always mesmerizing. The distinctive look he chose, shaving his head entirely, was a major gamble in an era when balding men often felt social stigma. Instead, Brynner made it stylish and bold, a veritable fashion statement that helped define his brand. It enthralled audiences, and he took home the Tony Award for Best Featured Actor in a Musical, though from a modern standpoint, he's typically remembered as a leading role. When 20th Century Fox decided to adapt The King and I into a major motion picture, they naturally turned to Yul Brynner. By then, he had become so identified with the king that not casting him would have been unthinkable. The 1956 film starred Deborah Kerr opposite Brynner, and it was a massive hit. Yul's performance earned him the Academy Award for Best Actor, a relatively rare feat for someone essentially reprising a stage role. Only a handful of performers have won both a Tony and an Oscar for the same character, putting Yul in an elite group. Beyond the accolades, he catapulted into the ranks of top Hollywood leading men. His bald head, which had started as a novelty for the stage, became a staple. He recognized that it gave him a unique, exotic edge in a world of leading men with standard haircuts. Fans began imitating the look, and eventually, the iconic superhero character Professor Charles Xavier in Marvel's X-Men was famously inspired by Brynner's shaved head. If you look at the original drawings of Professor X by Jack Kirby, you can see the clear reference to Yul's trademark style. During this same stretch of time, Brynner's personal life was heating up in ways that sometimes spelled trouble. He'd begun an affair with screen legend Marlene Dietrich, who was 19 years his senior. Rumor has it they bonded over their shared European heritage, love of music, and glamorous lifestyles. The problem was Brynner was still married to Virginia Gilmore, though that marriage was well on its last legs. In 1960, Gilmore filed for divorce and the dissolution of their union was finalized, though it hardly ended the drama in his private life. Also in 1959, Yul fathered a daughter with a 20-year-old woman named Frankie Tilden. He was 39 at the time. Attempting to maintain secrecy, he supported the child financially, but tried to hide the affair from the public. Eventually, the secret got out, and it only reinforced his reputation as a romantic, if rather irresponsible figure who indulged in fleeting passions. Not long after, in 1960, Brynner married again, this time to the Chilean model Doris Kleiner. Their wedding took place on the set of The Magnificent Seven, a Western that would go on to become another of his signature roles. The Magnificent Seven was directed by John Sturges and featured an ensemble cast including Steve McQueen, Charles Bronson, James Coburn, and others. Supposedly, tensions ran high between McQueen and Brynner. The conflict stemmed partly from McQueen's insecurity about screen time and dialogue. Brynner had the lion's share of lines, and McQueen worried he might fade into the background. So he devised subtle on-camera tricks, like fidgeting with his hat, shaking his gun, or flipping coins to draw audience eyes toward him, even when Brynner was the one speaking. Yul, not to be outdone, apparently resorted to his own tactics, like building up small mounds of dirt to stand on, so he appeared taller than McQueen in their scenes. Whenever McQueen noticed these earthen pedestals, he would promptly flatten them with his boots. This rivalry, ironically, contributed to the film's enduring charm, two alpha males jockeying for prominence in front of the camera, which mirrored the film's tough guy dynamics. Audiences loved it, and The Magnificent Seven became a classic Western, generating sequels and spin-offs, though Yul only appeared in some of them. Meanwhile, Yul's second marriage lasted about 7 years, during which time they welcomed a daughter named Victoria. Her godmother was none other than Katharine Hepburn. But the union with Doris Kleiner didn't endure. They divorced in 1967. By the mid-1960s, Yul was experiencing serious financial headaches due to taxes. Despite being a U.S. citizen since 1943, he often worked overseas, especially in Europe. He found himself in a complicated scenario where he was losing out on possible tax exemptions. Instead of trying to untangle the knots, he chose a more radical path. He officially renounced his American citizenship in 1965, while in Bern, Switzerland, apparently with the sole motivation of saving money on taxes. Predictably, the move garnered him criticism. Some Americans labeled him a traitor or an ingrate, especially given that he had earned his greatest success and fame in the United States. Yet Brynner didn't seem to lose much sleep over it, forging ahead with his globe-spanning career and personal life. His third major marriage arrived in 1971, when he wed Jacqueline Jackie Simone Thion de la Chaume, a French socialite with an imposing aristocratic lineage. Together, they adopted 2 Vietnamese children, Mia and Melody, during the wave of international adoptions from Vietnam that occurred before and during the tumultuous final years of the Vietnam War. Seeking a residence fit for a king, Yul and Jackie purchased a 16th century manor in northwestern France, Manoir de Criquebeuf. It sounded like an idyllic setting, but Brynner's insatiable appetite for performing and traveling soon caused problems. He embarked on extended tours with theatrical productions, including revivals of The King and I. By this time, he was practically synonymous with that role, having played it thousands of times. Yet, his constant absence from home, coupled with widely rumored affairs with female fans, he had seemingly learned not to tangle with his co-stars after the drama with Marlene Dietrich, made for a tense marriage. By 1981, Jackie had had enough, and the couple divorced. In 1983, the 62-year-old Brynner married for the 4th and last time, tying the knot with Kathy Lee, a ballerina 36 years, his junior. It was a whirlwind romance, though overshadowed by grim news. During a tour of The King and I, doctors discovered a lump, not on his vocal cords as initially suspected, but in his lungs. A heavy smoker for much of his life, some say up to 5 packs a day, he was diagnosed with inoperable lung cancer. For an actor who relied on a strong, resonant voice as well as robust physicality, this was devastating. Nonetheless, Brynner launched into radiation therapy, trying to keep up with his performing schedule as best he could. He briefly suspended the tour for treatment, only to return to the stage once the radiation course ended. In an astonishing display of determination, he continued performing The King on Broadway from January to June of 1985, by which point his health was precarious. Just 3 months after the final curtain fell, Yul Brynner passed away on October 10th, 1985, at the age of 65. Before his death, he made a poignant effort to dissuade others from smoking by recording a message that he wanted broadcast only after he was gone. The American Cancer Society used footage from an interview with him, featuring Brynner's haunting final plea, "Now that I'm gone, I tell you, don't smoke. Whatever you do, just don't smoke." The PSA aired in early 1986, mere days after his passing, leaving a powerful emotional impact on viewers who saw this once vibrant star reduced by illness. But how did the world remember him after the shock of his untimely death? In Vladivostok, the city of his birth, a park was christened Yul Brynner Park, and in 2012 officials unveiled a lifelike statue depicting him in regal posture, a nod to his definitive portrayal of the king. The statue stands in silent tribute to a man whose presence was anything but silent. The ceremony was attended by his son, Rock Brynner, reminding everyone that despite the controversies and complicated relationships, Yul Brynner left behind a legacy of remarkable accomplishments. Interestingly, there's even more to Yul Brynner's story that rarely surfaces in quick summaries. Beyond the legendary roles, the awards, and the controversies, he was also a skilled photographer. Brynner spent years taking photographs behind the scenes on film sets, at home, and on his travels. Some of these images were eventually compiled into books, revealing a reflective side to a man often portrayed as a larger-than-life personality. In the realm of music, he never really abandoned his guitar. While he didn't often sing publicly, he kept that musical spirit alive in personal settings. He was also rumored to have dabbled in songwriting, though these attempts didn't see the light of day on a commercial level. As for the expansions of his stage career, it's sometimes forgotten that after The King and I, Brynner was quite busy in Hollywood. He starred in Anastasia, 1956, alongside Ingrid Bergman, played the charismatic Solomon in Solomon and Sheba, 1959, and portrayed an iconic gunslinger-turned-android in the cult sci-fi western Westworld, 1973, a role that would spark a massive franchise decades later, including a popular television series. Despite these varied roles, The King and I remained the singular anchor of his career. By the time of his final appearances, he had performed the King 4,625 times, a figure so staggering that he reportedly could recite his lines in his sleep, and perhaps occasionally did. We also can't overlook his flamboyant personality. Off-screen, Brynner was known for wearing striking outfits, silk shirts, sashes, bold jewelry, accentuating his exotic looks and larger-than-life persona. He was often photographed hobnobbing with high society, from European aristocrats to American moguls and Hollywood starlets. His home in France, the Manoir de Criquebeuf, played host to lavish gatherings, though these were not always raucous parties. Brynner, in some sense, embraced the role of an urbane host who enjoyed intimate soirees featuring fine cuisine, wine, and of course lively conversation. Speaking of cuisine, he even published a cookbook titled the Yul Brynner Cookbook, Food Fit for the King and You, showcasing recipes from various cuisines he had encountered during his travels, reflecting that same international flair which had followed him since childhood. Another intriguing element is Yul's occasionally shifting backstory. Over the years, he told different versions of his heritage, sometimes describing himself as part Mongolian, part Japanese, or insisting that he was born on Sakhalin Island rather than Vladivostok. These stories likely grew out of a combination of playful myth-making and a desire to cultivate a truly exotic image in an era when marketing an unusual heritage could boost an actor's mystery. Some scholars suggest he borrowed details from his father's Swiss ancestry or from the multi-ethnic heritage of his extended relatives in the Russian Far East. Whatever the reasons, it added to the enduring mystique that was Yul Brynner. Regarding his directorial talents, which often get overshadowed by his extraordinary film and stage career, he directed a number of television episodes and stage productions in the late 1940s and early 1950s. He demonstrated a strong command of dramatic pacing and had a flair for guiding actors to deliver sincere, nuanced performances. However, once The King and I catapulted him to star status, the scheduling demands of constant revivals, tours, and film offers left him with little time to continue directing regularly. Occasionally, he would take an advisory role behind the scenes, especially in productions of The King and I that he led. Cast members often described him as demanding but immensely knowledgeable. He expected absolute dedication from his colleagues, but he also inspired a unique camaraderie among those who stuck it out. Brynner's complicated personal life continued to be the subject of gossip. His out-of-wedlock daughter with Frankie Tilden caused plenty of whispers in Hollywood and beyond. Then there was Marlene Dietrich, an affair that was never fully confirmed or denied by either party, but widely accepted as fact among those who followed Hollywood gossip. On top of that, his rumored romantic liaisons with fans during tours prompted tabloids to portray him as a kind of unstoppable seducer. Some friends argued that he was simply lonely on the road, and that these flings were fleeting ways to stave off isolation. Others said he had a genuine addiction to the thrill of new conquests. But no matter where the truth lay, the stories only fueled the almost mythical persona that swirled around him. He also developed notorious quirks as he got older. Some recalled that whenever he traveled, he was extremely particular about his living quarters. He insisted on a particular shade of tan on the walls of his hotel suite or dressing room, and demanded that the kitchen be stocked with exactly 12 brown eggs, never white, and a precise arrangement of groceries. He would pay handsomely for these eccentric requirements, so most establishments were all too happy to accommodate. Some chalked it up to star-level vanity, while others speculated that these were simply little routines that helped him focus in the high-pressure world of live performance. Despite all these complexities and controversies, Brynner remained an enduring leading figure in Hollywood. For instance, as Pharaoh Ramses II in The Ten Commandments, 1956, directed by Cecil B. DeMille, he held his own against Charlton Heston's buff portrayal of Moses. Yul, determined not to look puny next to Heston, embarked on a rigorous workout regime, weightlifting and dieting, to enhance his physique. The result? A confident, muscular Ramses that glimmered on screen, fueling the success of what became one of the biggest biblical epics of the era. He also appeared in lesser-known but still noteworthy films, such as The Buccaneer, 1958, The Journey, 1959, and Taras Bulba, 1962, showcasing varying shades of his acting range. Many praised his disciplined approach and that underlying sense of danger or intensity he brought to even the quieter roles. In the 1970s, he discovered a new generation of fans through his role as the gunslinger in Michael Crichton's Westworld, 1973. The film combined science fiction and Western elements, casting Brynner as a robotic gunslinger in a futuristic amusement park. The sight of him returning to a Western motif, this time as a terrifyingly unstoppable android, thrilled audiences. That portrayal, with his unwavering gaze and slow mechanical movements, would become iconic in sci-fi history, eventually helping inspire the later HBO series Westworld. Yul's original performance remains a landmark for how to create an unsettling yet charismatic villain. Even though he was riding high in pop culture, personal struggles never strayed far. After divorcing Doris Kleiner and eventually Jackie Delachaume, Brynner's romantic entanglements kept swirling. By the time he met Kathy Lee, the ballerina whom he married in 1983, he was already in his early 60s. It seemed like this might be the final chapter in his love life. Yet tragedy overshadowed any fresh marital bliss when that diagnosis of lung cancer arrived. As previously mentioned, once doctors detected the inoperable tumor, Yul had to push pause on the very thing he loved most, performing. After receiving radiation therapy, he rallied once again for The King and I, determined to go out with a bang, giving fans and colleagues the chance to see him in what had become one of the most famous star vehicle roles in musical theater history. By the end of the show's run in June 1985, he was frail, but the applause was thunderous. Colleagues described him summoning every ounce of energy to deliver a regal performance, stepping off stage each night utterly exhausted. His death on October 10, 1985, felt like the closing of a grand century-spanning story, though in truth, he was only 65. The anti-smoking commercial that aired soon after, featuring Brynner's moving plea, added a coda to his legend. Here was an actor who had lived life on his own terms, lavishly and unapologetically, and yet wanted to spare others the grief he had come to know. In subsequent years, philanthropic and artistic endeavors have helped cement his legacy. His daughter Victoria became involved in branding and marketing, connecting designer products with celebrities. His son Rock published writings about his father, exploring the enigma behind the star's public image. In Vladivostok, Yul Brynner Park stands as a testament to a hometown boy who journeyed across the world, soared to the pinnacle of Broadway and Hollywood fame, then left the stage for good, yet remained memorable enough to receive tributes decades after his passing. Another dimension not often highlighted is Yul's philanthropic inclination. While he wasn't known for large-scale charitable campaigns, he did lend his name and time to causes related to theatrical arts, especially for underprivileged children in the performing arts. Some records show that he quietly supported certain cultural organizations and even made donations to schools that promoted music and drama for youth. While these efforts never reached the scale or publicity of some of his contemporaries, it offers a glimpse of a man who did care deeply about the arts and the next generation of performers, perhaps recalling his own precarious adolescence, where he found hope and self-expression through music and acrobatics. And so we remember him not just as the king, but as a multifaceted artist whose story spanned continents and whose influence persists in pop culture. From the small boy in Vladivostok, overshadowed by parental abandonment, to the flamboyant star who sipped champagne in a 16th century French manner, he never ceased to embrace his own path. Perhaps that's the enduring lesson of Yul Brynner, the ability to inhabit grand roles both on and off the stage, forging an identity that, while riddled with controversy and scandal, was also punctuated by moments of brilliance and generosity. It's the reason why, all these decades later, we still return to his movies, listen to recordings of his rich baritone on the original King and I Cast album, and marvel at that statuesque bronze figure in Russia that pays tribute to a true show business legend. Even though the man himself has faded into history, his gaze and that compelling story remains as riveting now as it ever was.